Welcome to this second CEN webinar of the year. The topic of the webinar today is the small and medium-sized enterprises and the use of the CEN and CENELEC Guide 17. Due to this specific topic, we have the pleasure to welcome today a co-presenter who is Sandrine Laurent. Sandrine is project manager in SBS, Small Business Standard, and as you know, SBS represents the European SMEs in the standard making process at European and international levels. On the other hand, we have Ingrid Soutard, our colleague from CCMC, who is program manager and is the contact point for SMEs within CCMC. The webinar today will last about 30 minutes. It means that for getting the best of it, we will follow the principle that all the attendees are muted, but this doesn't prevent you to ask questions. So feel free to put all the questions you feel in the right side of your screen in the box. I think that we will not have time to look at the questions directly during this webinar to keep a bit in the schedule, but be assured that we will answer any kind of question that will be raised today by written, and this list of questions and answers will be uploaded on the website afterwards. Of course, you will be kept informed when it is done. Now it's time to give the floor to the speakers of today, so Ingrid, it's yours now.
Thank you, Nathalie. I will indeed speak about CEN-CENELEC Guide 17. The aim of CEN-CENELEC Guide 17 is to raise awareness on issues that may be of importance to SMEs in the development of standards and to overcome possible non-representation of SMEs in standardization work. Although we often refer to Guide 17 as the SME Guide, the guide is not addressed to SMEs, but to all those who write standards, among which SMEs that could be experts in technical bodies and working groups, and to national standard bodies, national committees, who provide support to those standard writers. Why do we need such a guide? Because SMEs represent 99.8% of European entrepreneurs. We know that there are more than 20 million SME enterprises in Europe, that they employ 80 million people, that SMEs are present in the majority of sectors, and just like any user of a standard, SMEs benefit from the technical expertise of the standards, although they may not have been present during the elaboration of the standard. But we also know that SMEs may have a weaker position in their product or service markets because of their dependency on larger competitors, suppliers or customers, and that they may have to adapt to the existing solutions on the market as well as to the European standards. That is why SME involvement in the development of standards is supported by a number of actions by CEN and CENELEC in collaboration with SBS, Small Business Standards. But still, standards for SMEs have specific constraints, and we often hear SMEs say, standards are too costly. The standardization process requires an investment of time, which is sometimes difficult for SMEs to achieve or comply with. SMEs are very heterogeneous and do not always have the necessary resources to take part in the standardization process. And SMEs often say that they don't understand the standards. They are too complicated, too long, too many, and I have no clue what the standard is about. Therefore, CEN and CENELEC developed a guide for standard writers with tips, techniques and examples for writing SME-friendly standards. The guide is available in 27 languages and was developed in close cooperation with NORMAPME. NORMAPME was the former European organization representing the interests of crafts and SMEs in standardization. NORMAPME no longer exists, but SBS has in the meantime taken over this task. Sandrine Laurent is with us to represent SPS and provide SMEs input to this webinar. Sandrine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ingrid. Standard writers have to bear in mind that the standard will also be used by micro, small and medium-sized enterprises who may not have been involved in the writing process of the standard itself, but want to use the standard. In other cases, SMEs participate to the development phases. Their contributions are essential to be integrated, in particular in sectors where they are predominant. The fact that they did not participate to the development process of the standard cannot be a barrier for the SMEs to use the standard. Guide 17 makes standards writers think about costs of implementation of some standards and many other things. The Guide 17 draws special attention to address the interest of SMEs and micro-enterprises as potential users of standards. It also asks standard writers to think about cost of implementation of standards and many other things.
Guide 17 follows a similar structure as a standard. Starting with the scope, which indicates that the guide provides guidance to writers of European standards on the needs of micro, small and medium-sized enterprises in order to avoid the exclusion of SMEs from the market and distortion of fair competition. The scope of Guide 17 mentions that the guide is relevant to all involved in standardization, being standard writers in working groups or technical committees, as well as members of national mirror committees. The scope also mentions that not all principles that are in the guide necessarily have to apply to all standards, and that TCs and working groups are the best place to evaluate if and how to address the specific needs of SMEs in their standards. Under normative references, you will only find one document, which are the Internal Regulations Part 3, called Rules for the Structure and Drafting of CEN-CENELEC Publications, also known as the PNE Rules. Under Terms and Definitions, you will find, for example, what is a micro-enterprise, what is a small enterprise, what is a guide, who is a standard writer, and so on.
The General Conditions part reminds standards writers to ensure that standards are understandable by those who wish to apply them, and to consider the sometimes diverging interest of SMEs. For example, the interest that consultants, certifiers, research laboratories, testing houses have may be divergent from the interest of enterprise involved in manufacturing or distribution of the product or service. The most important part, and probably the biggest, of Guide 17 relates to issues to be considered during the standard development process, from new work item to implementation. What these issues are, we will explain in more details later on.
And after that, we will have a look at the checklist that is also included in Guide 17.
The CEN-CENELEC Internal Regulations Part 2 stress the importance of best interests of the European market. This is a requirement that all relevant stakeholders should be consulted in order to properly assess the market relevance of a new proposed work item. This is also the reason why standardization stakeholders, such as SMEs, play a role in considering the market relevance. This is also reflected in the CEN-CENELEC Guide 17, which states, for new work item proposals, the market needs shall be clearly specified, reflecting also the SME relevance.
The indication of the SME relevance is given in the forms that are used by CEN as well as CENELEC for new work item proposal. For CEN, this is the former Form N, as well as the former Form A, which is now called Proposal for a New Field of Technical Activities or New Project Committee, through the indication of a clause that is written, a simple and concise statement identifying and describing relevant affected stakeholder categories, including small and medium-sized enterprises, in particular those who are immediately affected from the proposal, and how they will each benefit from or be impacted by the proposed deliverables.
During the whole process of developing a standard, the costs for implementing the standard should be considered before introducing provisions or requirements that may put disproportionate or unnecessary constraints to SMEs, and then in particular to microenterprise, when, for example, they would have to change technology or have additional costs for buying new equipment, training, testing, hiring consultants, and so on. Standard writers also have to bear in mind that all elements that are necessary to meet a certain requirement are available on the market, such as testing equipment, IPR, and so on.
There are several things standard writers can do to help SMEs when developing the content of the standard. The first one is to improve the understanding and use of the standard by adding examples and explanations. This is a bit a contradiction with our internal regulations part 3, PNE rules, which say that whenever possible, requirements shall be expressed in terms of performance rather than design or descriptive characteristics. This approach leaves maximum freedom to technical development and so on. But in reality, the performance approach is sometimes a bit difficult to understand, and it would be easier if the requirements were accompanied by examples and explanation. For example, by adding some extra text, illustration, graphs or tables that focus on simple implementation methods. Such information would facilitate and increase the implementation of standards by SMEs that may have difficulties in transposing pure performance requirements into practical solutions.
The guide also advises to provide an introduction, an abstract of the standard that should contain explanation of the reasons for the creation and/or the motivation for all modifications or revisions, the type of business and/or activities covered by the standard, the range of products to which the standard is applicable. It would also be good if the target groups are detailed as far as possible.
I guess there is no need to remind you that the standard has to have a scope. Please ensure that the standard does not cover issues that are not clearly defined in its scope, but on the other hand, the standard should deal with all the aspects that are mentioned in the scope.
And this is in particular important for SMEs, because they are often specialized in a narrow range of products and services, and the scope needs to be defined in a way that it is clear what products and services are covered. For what concerns testing, tests for compliance with standards are often a significant financial burden for small manufacturers. This includes costs of measuring equipment, staff training, time and resources necessary to perform the test. Small enterprises usually do not produce on mass scale, and their products may have specific characteristics. Imposing a high number of testings significantly increase the price of their products. So please, ensure that standards do not introduce any unnecessary tests, and that in case of doubt, based on the adequacy and necessity of a given test method, it should not be added to the existing test regime. In order to allow flexibility in verification of the requirements, please also take into account alternative methods, including calculations and tabular methods for the assessment, whenever possible, and ensure that the results of the tests described in the standards are unambiguous.
Standards should be designed in a user-friendly way. If the standard tends to be too voluminous, try to divide it into parts for a more narrow range of products, processes or services. Standards should be as clear, logical and easy to follow as possible. Important provisions should be highlighted and explained as far as possible, but at the same time these explanatory parts should not complicate the structure of the document. The layout of the text should be adapted so far as possible to the purpose of the standard and the needs of the target audience. Adding charts, graphs, drawings and clarifying examples of application may significantly facilitate the understanding of a standard. These examples could be part of the main text or added in an annex.
Many entrepreneurs from small business may not have the time or the resources to study the standard thoroughly. They need to be able to easily find the information relevant to them. Making the operational part of the standards more visible may encourage small enterprises to use them more often. Remember that users of the standards have different qualifications, knowledge and education, and they should all be able to understand the parts of the standard which is relevant to them. Even if standards are directed at persons with knowledge of specific products, processes or services, they still need to be written in a simple and clear language, so that they are all comprehensible by standard users who have not been directly involved in their preparation. There are some simple tips to bear in mind, such as explain all the abbreviations and acronyms that are used. Use the same terms consistently through the text.
If you need to refer to other standards, a repetition of short excerpts from other standards might be preferred instead of just referring to the standards. If you do reproduce a short excerpt, don't forget to mention the source. And please avoid that there are a large number of normative references, because that makes the operability of standards more complex.
And if your standard is a revision of a previous standard, ensure that clear information on the changes made to the previous version is provided in the new or revised standard. The Internal Regulations Part 3 mentioned that the foreword of the standard shall contain a statement of significant technical changes from any previous edition of the document. In case a European standard introduces a completely new requirement or solution in some countries, think about prolonging the coexistence period. It may be necessary for the SME to buy new equipment, to change the organization of work, and to train staff. And it is especially difficult and expensive for small enterprises to change their business model, particularly if it was functioning well before. Therefore, an extended period of coexistence of the previous and new standards may be needed.
If standard writers have done their best to write a standard as simple as possible, but that particular standardization area is so complex, for example because of legislation, then maybe the standard writers can create an additional guidance document like an implementation manual, but that should not be used as a justification for developing complex standards. At the end of the guide, you will find a checklist that reflects all the recommendations from Guide 17. Standard writers may find the table useful in ensuring that needs of SMEs have been considered during the drafting of a new standard or the revision of an existing one. This is an example of the checklist. The checklist has the form of a table which follows the steps in the standards development process from left to right, and each of the check boxes is explained in detail in the corresponding sections of the guide. This closes the presentation of CEN-CENELEC Guide 17. which, by the way, also exists as ISO guide since April 2013 and has been submitted to inquiry at ISO and IEC level to become an ISO IEC guide. The deadline at ISO and IEC was January. ISO and IEC are considering the comments received, and their intention is to send the guide to vote in July-August. From today's webinar, the key learning points are:
SMEs are the driver of European economy and hence a key stakeholder for standardization. They may, however, be underrepresented in standard writing groups, and their interests may thus not be sufficiently taken into account.
CEN-CENELEC Guide 17 provides guidance to writers of European standards to improve the inclusion of SMEs into the development process initiated by a market relevance assessment.